The morning didn't come with sunlight, came with sirens. By the time I stepped outside Malik's apartment, the street was already crawling with unmarked cars, black SUVs, tinted windows, engines idling low, like predators breathing in the dark. They were here, and they weren't hiding. Malik stood beside me, silent, his jaw set. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. We both knew what this was. The final move. The inevitable end of the game. I half expected them to rush us, to throw us to the ground, hands behind our backs, zip ties cutting off circulation. But that wasn't their style. Not in public. Not with the whole world watching. No, they'd play the smarter, cleaner, quiet. They wanted me to disappear, but they'd waited too long. Because the story was already out there. The damage was done, and the city was burning. The footage, the interviews, the names, the records. It hit the city like a lightning strike. Fast, violent, irreversible. By 10 a.m., protests flooded the precinct. Not just a few dozen voices with signs, but thousands, shutting down streets, chanting Devin Brooks's name. By noon, state officials had issued statements. Careful, measured, filled with the usual empty promises about thorough investigations and ensuring justice. But no one was buying it. Not this time, because I had given them the whole truth. And there was no covering it up now. I wasn't stupid. I knew what was coming. I'd embarrassed the system, exposed it, threatened to tear it apart. And the system wasn't going to forgive me for that. They couldn't just kill me, not openly, but they could destroy me in other ways. Discredit me, bury me under legal attacks, frame me for something worse. Or wait until the story faded, until public outrage cooled, until people forgot. Then they'd finish the job. Quiet, clean, final. But they underestimated one thing. I wasn't running. The first knock came just after 1 p.m. A hard, deliberate fist against Malik's door. I didn't move at first. I just stood there listening, watching. Malik met my gaze. Didn't say anything. The knock came again. Louder, sharper. I stepped forward, every nerve on edge, and opened the door. 2 men stood there. Suits, no badges, no names. Just the cold, blank faces of men used to people doing exactly what they were told. One of them smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Mr. Carter, we need to talk." They didn't bother asking if they could come in. They walked past me like they owned the place. Like they owned me. I didn't argue. I shut the door and watched them, heart pounding in my chest. Malik stood to the side, arms crossed, his glare sharp enough to draw blood. The taller one, the one with the fake smile, was the first to speak. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble, Mr. Carter." I said nothing. He smiled wider. "But you already knew that." Still, I said nothing. He looked around, nodding slightly. "We're here to offer you a way out." I let the words hang in the air. "Way out of what?" I asked finally. "Out of this situation." His voice was smooth, easy. "We understand mistakes were made, but there's no need for anyone else to get hurt." He didn't say it like a threat. He didn't have to. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He chuckled lightly. "No, Mr. Carter, but the story can go away. The footage, the files, the interviews, all of it. You could issue a correction. Say it was fabricated. Say you were misled, that you made a mistake. A simple mistake." I met his gaze and held it. "You're wasting your time," I said. His smile faded. Just a little. The second man stepped forward, his eyes hard, colder. "You think this is about right and wrong?" he said. "You think anyone's going to remember Devin Brooks in 6 months? A year? You think these protests are going to change anything?" His voice dropped lower. "This city doesn't run on truth. It runs on power." The words hit me like a slap. Not because they shocked me, but because they didn't. That was the system. The one I'd been fighting against my whole life. And I wasn't about to stop now. I stood taller, straighter. "Then you're going to have to kill me," I said. Neither man moved. Neither blinked. But the room shifted, darkened. Because we all knew that's where this was headed. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. And I was ready for it. They left without another word. No threats. No promises. Just a look. One I wouldn't forget. Malik shut the door behind them and turned to me. "They'll come back," he said. I nodded. "I know." He looked at me for a long second. "Then we don't stay here." I wanted to argue. Wanted to say I wasn't running. But this wasn't about running. It was about surviving. Because the story was bigger than me now. It was out there. But if I wanted to make sure it stayed there, I needed to live long enough to protect it. By nightfall, Harlan had resigned. Not voluntarily, not gracefully, but with his face plastered across every news station, his lies shredded in public view. And the mayor? She was next. Her press conference came late, after hours of closed-door meetings. She looked tired, hollow. "We are committed to transparency," she said. "We are committed to justice." But no one believed her. Not anymore. And when the first calls for her resignation started, she didn't argue, because she knew it was coming. And it was coming fast. Malik and I watched it unfold from an old motel room, miles from the city. We didn't sleep, didn't talk much, just watched the fire we'd started burn through the system, unstoppable now. And it wasn't just about Devin anymore. It was about every name like his, every face, every silence, the voices that had been ignored, erased. Not anymore. The phone rang again. Same number, same silence. I answered, said nothing, and the voice on the other end was quieter this time, smaller. "You don't know what you've done." I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I do." They hung up first, because they knew they'd lost, and I'd won, not because I was stronger or smarter, but because I refused to stop, because I told the truth. And sometimes that's enough to burn an empire down. The courtroom was still, heavy, like the air itself knew how final Judge Beckett's words had been. Ellie stood frozen beside me, her jaw tight, eyes burning with frustration. I felt hollow, my hope caving in like a house with rotten beams. That was it, I thought. 13 years of fighting and I lost. But then the courtroom door creaked open. Everyone turned. Slow, curious. Even Beckett glanced up, his face barely shifting. And there, in the doorway, stood a man. Older, thin. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his eyes darted around the room like a man stepping into danger. I need to speak," the man said, his voice rough, uncertain. Beckett's brow arched. "Who are you?" The man swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "Name's Calvin Morris." He hesitated, his gaze flicking to me, then back to Beckett. I have information about the Griffin case. About Derrick Cole." I blinked. My heart kicked against my ribs. I didn't know him. I'd never seen this man before. But something in his face told me this wasn't a stunt. Something about the way his hands trembled. How his eyes couldn't meet mine. Beckett stared him down like a wolf eyeing prey. "If you have information, you should speak to the proper authorities. This hearing is closed." Ellie took a sharp step forward. "Your Honor, if this man has information, it's relevant. We request he be allowed to speak." Beckett's jaw tightened. For a long moment I thought he'd refuse. Thought he'd wave his hand, have the man tossed out like garbage. But then he said, 5 minutes. His gaze pinned Calvin like a nail. "No more." Calvin nodded, his face pale. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the floor, and stood in the center of the room. For a second, all I could hear was the dull buzz of the lights overhead. And then he spoke. "I lied. 2 words. That's all it took to set the world spinning. I lied 13 years ago," Calvin said, his voice shaking. I said I saw Derrick kill Robert Griffin. I didn't. I never did." A breath left me in a rush. Ellie's eyes widened, her fingers curling tight around her notes. The room itself seemed to freeze. Beckett's stare darkened. "You're telling this court you committed perjury?" Calvin nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes, sir. I was scared. The cops, they leaned on me, said they had proof it was Derrick. Said if I didn't testify, they'd pin it on me. Said no one would believe me over him." His voice cracked. "I didn't know what else to do. I was just trying to survive." A sound built in my chest, half laugh, half sob, but I swallowed it down. "You ruined a man's life," Ellie said quietly, her voice tight with fury. 13 years. "Do you understand what you did?" Calvin's eyes met mine, and for a second I saw it, guilt so heavy it looked like it was crushing him. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I did." Beckett's face was carved stone, his hands folded neatly on the bench. "Why come forward now?" Calvin's shoulders slumped. I couldn't carry it anymore. Every night I saw his face. I saw what I'd done. I'm sorry. Sorry. The word felt small, weak. I wanted to hate him, wanted to stand and spit the years back in his face. The birthdays I missed, the family I lost, My mother's funeral, where they wouldn't let me out to say goodbye. 13 years of waiting for a day that seemed like it would never come. But the hate burned out before it could find its voice. Because the truth was, it wasn't just Calvin's lie that buried me. It was the whole system. The police, the prosecutor, the judge. The world that said a black man was guilty before he opened his mouth. Beckett's eyes didn't waver. And what proof do you have that this isn't just another lie? Calvin swallowed. I kept something. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper worn and creased. The night of the murder, I was with someone. I wasn't near that alley, but I didn't say. I didn't want trouble. His hands shook as he unfolded it, laying it flat on the table. She wrote this, said if I ever needed it, to use it. Ellie stepped forward, picking it up. Her brow furrowed as she read, her lips moving silently. Then she looked up, her face pale but fierce. It's a statement from a woman named Jasmine Reed. She says Calvin was with her the entire night of the murder, that he couldn't have witnessed anything. It's dated the night after Griffin's death. The room tensed, pulled tight like a wire about to snap. Beckett's eyes narrowed. Why didn't you turn this in years ago? I was scared, Calvin whispered, of the cops, of what might happen if they found out. I didn't know what else to do, but I can't live with it anymore. Not after everything. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I could feel Beckett's anger burning, the shame twisting behind his cold stare. Finally, he spoke. This will require further verification. Ellie's voice cut through the room, sharp and unyielding. Your Honor, you have a sworn statement. You have a man admitting to perjury under oath. Derrick deserves justice now. Beckett's mouth was a thin, bitter line. For a second, I thought he'd fight it, that he'd find some way to stall, to bury this like he buried me. But something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of doubt, a sliver of fear. We will reconvene tomorrow, he said stiffly. This court is adjourned. The gavel cracked down like thunder, and just like that, it was over. Or at least it should have been. But as I was led back to my cell, the weight didn't lift. The walls still pressed in. The cold still settled in my bones. Because I'd learned something in those 13 years. Hope was a dangerous thing, and I wasn't free yet. That night, back in my cell, sleep didn't come. I lay on the thin, lumpy mattress, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. My mind wouldn't stop turning, wouldn't stop replaying Calvin's words. I lied. The sound of them echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls like the cold, bitter truth it was. I should have felt relief. I should have been celebrating, imagining freedom, thinking about what I'd do first if I ever stepped outside these walls. But I wasn't. I didn't trust it. Not yet. Not when Judge Beckett still held the final word. I'd seen his face when Calvin spoke. Tight, controlled, like a man losing grip. Beckett wasn't the type to admit fault, not easily. And certainly not when it meant admitting his bias, his failure. I wasn't naive. If there was any way for Beckett to keep me buried, he'd find it. So I waited, just like I had for 13 years. The next morning, I was led back to the courtroom. Same cold walls. Same wooden bench where I sat in my blues, shackled, my hands heavy with the weight of metal. Ellie sat beside me, her face sharp with focus, her notes spread across the table. And across the room, Judge Beckett took his seat. He didn't look at me, not once. Calvin Morris was already there, hunched over, eyes red-rimmed like he hadn't slept either. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not yet, maybe not ever. But I could see it in his face. He was a man carrying the weight of his own cowardice. Maybe it was enough. Maybe it wasn't. Beckett's gavel slammed down. This court is in session. His voice was flat, cold. I have reviewed the statement provided by the witness. Further investigation is pending. Ellie stood, her voice steady. Your Honor, this man admitted to perjury under oath. The statement he provided confirms that Derrick Cole's conviction was based on false testimony. There is no reason to delay. Derrick Cole deserves to be freed. Beckett's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and cutting. And yet, we do not release men based on emotion and assumption, counselor. We require facts. Verified facts. Ellie didn't back down. You have them. She held up the statement like a weapon. The date, the details, they all align. Jasmine Reed is alive, ready to testify if necessary. Beckett's jaw tensed. His hands folded over the bench like he was holding something back. The court will consider the evidence in due process. My throat burned. I wanted to stand. I wanted to scream, How much longer? How much longer did I have to sit here rotting because of his pride? Because of his fear of being wrong? But I didn't move, didn't speak. I'd learned my lesson years ago. Beckett glanced at Calvin. Do you understand the consequences of your statement, Mr. Morris? You are admitting to perjury. That is a felony offense. You could face prison time. Calvin's face crumpled, but his voice didn't waver. I know. And you still stand by your statement? Beckett pressed. Calvin nodded. I do. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. And then Beckett said, low and sharp, court will recess. A final decision will be rendered tomorrow. The gavel came down again, like a sentence. Back in my cell, I slammed my fists against the wall. Not hard enough to break skin, but enough to feel the sting, the bite of it. I needed to feel something other than the weight pressing down on me. Tomorrow felt like a curse, like another day Beckett would use to find a way to keep me locked up. I didn't eat, couldn't, just sat in the dark, my back against cold concrete, my head heavy with doubt. Ellie came to see me that night. She stood on the other side of the glass, her face drawn but determined. He can't stall forever, she said. There's no legal ground for it. The evidence is solid. I looked at her, my eyes sharp. That man doesn't care about legal ground. He's looking for a way out, a way to bury this. You know it, Ellie. She didn't deny it. She didn't have to. We'll be ready, she said instead. I'm meeting with Jasmine Reed tonight. If Beckett tries to play games tomorrow, we'll have her here, ready to testify. Will it matter? I asked. My voice was low, hollow. Will any of it matter? Ellie leaned forward, pressing her hand against the glass. It has to, but we both knew better. Justice wasn't about truth. It wasn't about facts. It was about power, and Beckett held it in his fist. That night, sleep was a stranger. My thoughts spiraled. What if Beckett found a loophole? What if he claimed the statement wasn't enough? What if he said it was too late, that the process couldn't be undone? I didn't let myself imagine freedom. Didn't let myself think about walking under the sun, breathing air that wasn't tainted by cold stone and iron bars. Because if I let myself dream, I wasn't sure I'd survive if it was ripped away again. The next morning came cold and gray. Rain streaked the windows as they led me back to court. Chains clinking, steps slow. Ellie was there, her eyes shadowed but burning with fire, and beside her stood a woman, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back tight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Jasmine Reed. I didn't dare hope. Not yet. Beckett took his seat, his eyes sweeping over the room, cold and hard, and for the first time I saw it. The crack in his armor, the fear, the understanding that his mistake, the mistake he wanted to bury, was clawing its way to the surface. He picked up the papers on his bench, flipping through them, his brow furrowed, and then he looked up. This court has reviewed the evidence, he said, his voice tight, and it finds that sufficient cause exists to overturn the conviction of Derrick Cole. The words slammed into me. It didn't feel real. Not until the guard stepped forward and unlocked my cuffs. Not until the cold weight fell from my wrists. Not until Ellie reached for me, her hand warm and shaking. And the room erupted. Ellie's eyes filled with tears. Calvin dropped his head into his hands. Jasmine whispered a prayer under her breath. And Beckett? He sat there, still, silent, watching as the walls he built crumbled around him. I walked out of that courtroom a free man, but freedom didn't feel light, felt heavy, because even as I stood under the gray sky, the rain washing over me, I knew the truth. Justice hadn't freed me. Shame had. Beckett didn't let me go because it was right. He let me go because he was caught, because there was no hiding it anymore. And that was the hardest truth to carry. But I was free, and that was enough. For now. The first breath of freedom hit me like a punch. The rain slid down my face, soaking through my shirt, but I didn't care. I stood on the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of the sky press down. People passed, some staring, some pretending not to look. Ellie stood beside me, close but not touching, like she wasn't sure what I needed. Maybe I didn't know either. I should have felt joy, relief, but mostly I felt empty. 13 years, gone, and I didn't even know who I was anymore. Ellie cleared her throat. You ready? Her voice was soft, careful, like stepping too hard might shatter me. I looked out at the street. Cars rolled by. People hurried under umbrellas. The world had kept moving while I stood still. Where would I even go? I said, my voice rough. She hesitated. You can stay with me for now, just until you figure it out. I nodded, not because I wanted charity, but because I didn't have a choice. I had no home, no family left. The world I knew was gone. So I let her take me. Her apartment was small but warm, full of soft light and quiet things. Shelves lined with books, a kettle humming on the stove. It smelled like cinnamon and something sweet, but I didn't trust the comfort of it. Not yet, maybe not ever. Ellie showed me the guest room. Clean sheets, a window looking out over the street. She left me there, said to take my time, but I just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They didn't look like mine anymore. Calloused, scarred, prison hands. That night I didn't sleep. The mattress was too soft, the air too quiet. I was used to cold concrete, the rustle of men pacing their cells, the clang of metal. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for someone to slam the door open, to tell me it was a mistake, that I wasn't free, that it was just another trick. But morning came, soft and golden, and the door didn't open. The next few days passed slow, like walking through fog. Ellie was patient. She gave me space but didn't let me vanish. She asked if I wanted to talk about it, about the years, about Beckett, but I didn't. The words sat heavy in my chest. Too sharp, too close. So instead, she helped with the small things. Getting me an ID. Finding old clothes that didn't hang off me like a ghost. Setting up a doctor's appointment. I let her, because I didn't know how to be anything but lost. But the world wasn't patient. 2 days after I walked free, reporters came knocking. They wanted the story, wanted a quote, a headline, a moment to show on the news. How does it feel to be free? One asked, a microphone shoved too close. How did you survive? Another pressed. But no one asked the question that mattered. How does it feel to be forgotten? I didn't answer them, just stared until they left, their bright smiles fading. But not everyone stayed silent. Judge Beckett released a statement, said the court had made a difficult but necessary correction, said the justice system worked, that it eventually got it right. I almost laughed. The system didn't save me, failed me, again and again, until it couldn't anymore, until Calvin's guilt and Jasmine's truth crushed the lie. Beckett didn't give me justice. He gave me escape. And the cost of that escape? 13 years of my life. It didn't end there. Calvin came to see me. Ellie wasn't happy about it. She asked if I wanted her to turn him away. But I said no. I had to see him, had to look him in the eye. He stood on Ellie's porch, thin and hollow, his shoulders hunched like a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. I'm sorry, he said, the words breaking apart in his throat. I know it's not enough, but I am. I looked at him, really looked, and I saw the truth. Calvin wasn't evil. He wasn't a monster. He was just weak. A man who folded under fear and let me pay the price. Sorry doesn't give me my life back, I said. My voice wasn't angry, just tired. His eyes glistened. I know. I didn't say anything more. Didn't forgive him, because forgiveness wasn't a gift I had to give. Calvin stood there a while, waiting, hoping for something that wouldn't come. Then he turned and walked away, and I let him. That night, I sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. Ellie came in, sat beside me. She didn't ask questions. She didn't press. She just waited. And finally, I spoke. I don't know how to be free, I said, my voice low. I don't know what it means anymore. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, maybe you don't have to know. Maybe it's enough to just be here, one day at a time. It sounded simple, too simple, but maybe that was all there was. The next morning, I stood outside. The sky was clear, blue as glass, and I breathed, deep, slow. The air was sharp in my lungs, but it was real. I didn't know where my life was going, didn't know who I was, who I could be, but I was free, and that was a start. Freedom wasn't what I thought it would be. I kept waiting for it to feel real, for it to hit me like a wave. But most days, it felt like I was still locked inside, just without the walls. The world looked the same, but I didn't fit in it anymore. Ellie tried to help. She introduced me to people, told me about job programs, about places where men like me could find a second chance. But the second chance felt like a lie, like a rusted key that wouldn't quite fit the lock. Because the truth was, I wasn't the same man who went into that prison. I wasn't even sure I was a man at all, just a shadow of one. It wasn't long before I found out the price of my freedom. It wasn't just about starting over. It was about facing everything that was taken from me. The first ghost I had to face was my mother. I hadn't been there when she died. They told me about it through the bars, cold and sharp. Said she passed quietly, like it mattered, like it wasn't a knife driven into my chest. She was the only person who believed me, the only one who never gave up, who never doubted. She died waiting for me to come home. I stood at her grave, the wind cold and sharp. Her headstone was simple, too simple, just her name and 2 dates. Nothing about the years she spent fighting for me. Nothing about her hope. I stood there a long time, but I didn't speak. What could I say? Sorry wasn't enough. She was gone and I wasn't there. I wasn't there for her, and I'd never forgive myself for that. The second ghost was my brother, James. We weren't close, not even before prison. But he was family, blood, and when they locked me away, he walked too. Not into a cell, but into silence. He stopped writing, stopped visiting. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need him. But when you're alone for long enough, the silence cuts deeper than a blade. I found him living in a small apartment on the east side. He opened the door, and for a second, we just stood there, staring at each other. Derrick. His voice was flat, guarded. James. He stepped aside, but his face was stiff, closed off, like he wasn't sure what he was letting into his home. The place was clean but small. A couch that looked worn down. A TV with a cracked screen. We sat, the air thick between us. I heard, James said finally, about the case, about you getting out. I nodded. Yeah. Silence again, heavy. I didn't know what to do, he said, not looking at me. After they sent you away, I didn't know if it was true, if you were guilty. I let that sink in, felt it cut through me. You really think I could do that? I asked. My voice didn't shake, but it was close. He looked down, fingers twisting together. I didn't know what to think. They said you did it. Everyone said it. And he shook his head. I was scared. I didn't want it to be true, but I didn't know how to fight it. I swallowed hard, the anger rising like bile. So you didn't. You just walked away. He didn't deny it, just sat there, shoulders hunched. I'm sorry, he said, quiet, but it didn't feel enough. And maybe it wasn't, but I didn't have the strength to carry another grudge. I'm out, I said. That's enough for now. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but I left it there. That night, I sat on Ellie's porch, staring at the street. People passed by, laughing, holding hands, living lives that didn't have shadows clinging to them. Ellie came out, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. She handed me one and sat beside me. How'd it go? She asked. I shook my head. I don't know. Feels like the past is stuck to me, like I can't wash it off. She sipped her coffee, quiet for a moment. Maybe it's not about washing it off, she said. Maybe it's about learning to carry it without letting it crush you. I looked at her. Her face was calm but tired, like someone who knew about carrying heavy things. I don't know if I can, I said. Honest, Bear. She nodded. Then just start by carrying today. Later that night, I dreamed about the cell, about cold metal and stone, about chains. But when I woke up, there were no walls. Just the window, open, the breeze sliding in soft. I was still free, and maybe that had to be enough. But freedom came with a price, because the ghosts weren't done with me yet. The next morning, Ellie handed me a letter. No return address, no name, just my name scrawled across the front. I opened it slow, my fingers tight. Inside, just one line, written in sharp, tight handwriting. You may be free, but this isn't over. I stared at the words, felt the chill of them settle into my bones. I looked at Ellie, but I didn't say a word. Just folded it back, tucked it into my pocket, because I already knew. Freedom wasn't free, and some shadows don't let go. The words in that letter stuck to me like frost. You may be free, but this isn't over. I kept hearing them, even when the paper was folded and shoved deep in my pocket. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And I didn't know who it came from, but I could guess, because freedom was never free. Ellie noticed something was wrong the second she looked at me. She always did. What is it? She asked, her eyes sharp. I pulled the letter from my pocket and slid it across the table. Watched as she unfolded it, her brow furrowing as she read. She didn't say anything at first, just stared, the silence heavy between us. Do you think it's Beckett? She asked finally, her voice low. I don't know, I said, but deep down I had a feeling. Beckett wasn't the kind of man to take a fall quietly. His courtroom was his kingdom, and I'd torn down his walls. Or maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was someone else. Someone who didn't like seeing the system questioned. Could be anybody, I said. Someone who wanted me in that cell. Ellie's jaw tightened. You're not going back. Not ever. But the fear was already there, coiled in my gut. Because I'd learned one thing in prison. Innocence didn't protect you. I tried to push the fear down, but it followed me. Every corner I turned, every shadow that lingered too long. I caught myself looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to strike. And then it did. It started with small things. Car parked across from Ellie's place. Same car, same spot, every night. Phone calls that hung up when I answered. Silence on the other end. A man standing too long at the corner store, eyes sharp, watching me until I left. Little things. But in my gut, I knew. It wasn't random. And then, one night, I came home to find Ellie's porch light shattered. Glass on the steps, sharp and glittering in the dark. That's when I knew it wasn't just me. They wanted her to feel it too. Ellie wasn't the kind to scare easy. But that night, I saw it in her eyes. Not fear for herself. Fear for me. We should go to the police, she said. I laughed, but it wasn't the kind that felt good. You think they'll listen? After what they did? She didn't argue. Didn't have to. We both knew the answer. The same system that locked me away wasn't going to save me now. So, I told her the only thing I could. I'll handle it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch, watching the street, waiting for the shadow that would come. I didn't know if it would be a man, a word, or another letter. But I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. The shadow showed up 3 nights later. I saw the car first. Same one. Dark. Idling across the street, engine rumbling low. The driver didn't move, didn't get out. But I didn't wait. I crossed the street slow, my steps steady. The rain was falling, soft and steady, soaking through my shirt, but I didn't stop. I reached the driver's side, rapped my knuckles against the window. The man inside didn't flinch, just turned his head, slow and easy. It wasn't Beckett. It was a cop, Sergeant Miller. I recognized him from my trial. One of the men who stood beside the prosecutor, eyes sharp, arms folded. One of the men who helped put me away. I didn't expect him to smile, but he did. Evening, Cole, he said. Calm. Easy. What do you want? I kept my voice steady, though my pulse was hammering in my chest. He shrugged, his hand resting easy on the wheel. Just checking in. Making sure you're settling in all right. I stared at him. You been sitting outside every night just to check in? He didn't answer that. Just tilted his head, studying me. You got a nice place here. Shame if something happened to it. There it was. The threat dressed up in polite words. I took a step closer, close enough to see the rain glisten on his face. I'm not scared of you, he chuckled. You should be. You think that courtroom set you free? You think a statement from a scared little liar is enough to wash away what you are? His eyes narrowed. You're still a convict, Cole. And men like you? They don't stay free for long. He didn't say it loud, but he didn't have to. He pulled away slow, tires hissing on the wet road. I watched until the car disappeared, swallowed by the night. And then I went back inside. Ellie was waiting. Who was it? I shook my head. No one. Because what could I say? That the same system that took my life wanted to take it again? That freedom wasn't really freedom? That the fight wasn't over? But I wasn't going to run. Not this time. The next morning, I went to see Calvin. He answered the door slow, eyes wary. When he saw me, his face dropped, like he knew why I was there. Who else knew? I asked, skipping the small talk. About what you did. About the lie. Calvin swallowed hard, his hand tightening on the doorframe. The cops. They knew. Beckett knew. Everyone knew. I stared at him. And they let it happen. He nodded, shame sinking into his shoulders. They wanted it closed. Wanted someone to blame. His voice cracked. They didn't care who. I took a step back, the truth sinking deeper. It wasn't just Beckett. It wasn't just the system. It was a network. A web. One I'd been caught in. And I was still caught in it. That night, I sat on the porch again, watching the dark. Waiting. Because I knew this wasn't over. Not until I tore it all down. I wasn't a prisoner anymore. But if they thought I'd go back quietly, they were wrong. I wasn't going back. Not ever. And if they came for me again, they'd better be ready for a fight. If the story resonated with you, Share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.